Buying a home is about to get way more expensive due to the $418 million settlement that just took place from the National Association of Realtors. This ban essentially bans listing agents from being able to set compensation for buyer's agents when it comes to buying a home, which in turn could mean as a buyer, you're now responsible for paying your buyer's agent to help you find the perfect home. Now, for those of you who have been watching my channel for some period of time, my channel is all about real estate education, helping buyers, helping sellers understand not only the details of what's happening in the housing market, but also what you need to do in order to set yourself up for success. With that being said, this video is probably one of the most important videos I've done in the last 4 years. So if you are a buyer out there looking to buy in the near future, this is something you absolutely want to pay attention to. And with that said, if you find any value in my content at all, do me a favor and hit that thumbs up. And if you want to continue to get updated on changes that are happening in the housing market, along with what you can do to become a better buyer, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. So for the better part of my 20-year career in selling real estate, I've often gotten the question from prospective buyers looking to purchase a home, asking me what I charge in order to represent them. And it's always been a pretty easy answer, because the answer is you don't owe me anything. Essentially, my compensation is being paid by the seller and the selling agent that's selling the home. But unfortunately, that's about to change. And it's all because of the settlement that I mentioned earlier in the video. Now, one thing I want to get clear on before we go any further is addressing the idea that buyer's agent compensation was somehow fixed during this entire process, because that's essentially where the lawsuit stemmed from, that there was more or less collusion between brokerages and that there was price fixing when it came to commissions. And that is simply not true. As someone who is a listing agent and a buyer's agent, I typically see both sides of the transaction, which means when we're on the listing side, we're often talking to the seller not only about our commission, but how important it is as a seller to offer compensation to a buyer's agent. Because there really are 3 different sides to a transaction. You have the selling side of the transaction, you have the buying side of the transaction, and on top of that, you have the purchase agreement, a contract between the seller to sell a house and a buyer to buy the house. And that part of the transaction is often facilitated by an escrow company. In some states, it's a title company. And in other states, it might actually be an attorney facilitating the transaction. And with that said, all 3 parties are looking for compensation to make sure the deal goes smooth and that everyone gets to the finish line. So typically how it works as a listing agent is when we go into a listing presentation and we talk about compensation to the seller, we talk about what we charge as listing agents and what we would recommend the seller pay to the buyer side, who is typically the one bringing the buyer to the table. But the issue stems that some sellers didn't realize they were paying the buyer side of the transaction, which is absolutely crazy to me, because that means they thought they were paying that entire 5-6% or whatever was being charged to the listing agent by themselves. In addition, it created this idea that agents were somehow working together to fix prices and that compensation was never negotiable. And I'll be honest, in 20 years of selling real estate, I can only list a couple of times when I didn't have to negotiate compensation with the seller, because the seller doesn't have to agree on a set amount. Essentially, we go in as listing agents, say what we charge and what we recommend, but that doesn't necessarily mean the seller has to agree with it. In fact, if they don't like our negotiation at all, they can go get another agent or interview as many agents as they want. And the more agents you interview, the more differences you're going to have, not only on price recommendation, on marketing services, but also on compensation, what that listing agent is charging for their services. And on top of that, there's this belief that by eliminating that buyer side compensation being paid by the seller, that somehow it's going to be less expensive for a home buyer to buy a home, which in my opinion is absolute nonsense. And the reason there's this belief out there is because if sellers have always been paying, say, 5 to 6% in commissions, that if now they're only paying the listing side of the commission, let's say it's half of that, they're paying 3% or 2.5%, that the other 2.5% to 3% that was essentially built into that price is now going to bring the price down, since the seller is no longer offering that compensation. So with that, I'd like you to think from a seller's perspective. If my home value is, say, $1 million based on comparables in my area that sold before the changes, when that seller was essentially paying both the selling and the buying side commission, do you think sellers are now going to lower their price and say, now my home is only worth $970,000 or $975,000 because I'm no longer paying that commission? No, the seller is going to still think that their home is worth $1 million. which means home prices are not going to drop. The only thing that's going to change is it's going to become more expensive to be a buyer. But that's really where I want to talk about how this is going to look from a buyer perspective, because this is where it's really important and what you need to understand when you decide to hire the agent who is going to represent you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, for the better part of my career, when a buyer would come to me, we essentially had a verbal agreement. I never did the buyer broker agreement with buyers because my idea is I always worked with buyers who wanted to work with me. And in some cases, you get burned because you don't have a contract in place. But at the end of the day, I don't want to hold somebody to a contract that essentially doesn't want to be there. I want to work with people who want to work with me. And for the 20 years of my career, that's worked out really, really well. But this is where things are going to change. Going forward, as a buyer, you're now going to have to sign a buyer broker agreement with the agent who's going to represent you. And part of that agreement is going to discuss what that buyer's agent is expecting in compensation in order to represent you on buying a home. Now, as a buyer, you have a couple of different options. You can choose to not have a buyer's agent and try to represent yourself. You can go to the listing agent to have the listing agent represent you, and we'll talk about how that might look here in just a minute. But this is where you as a buyer need to think long and hard about the agent that you're hiring to represent you. Because in the past, you've been able to hire your cousin or the person that just got their real estate license to represent you because they were getting paid by the MLS. You didn't care if they were new. You didn't really care if you had professional services because at the end of the day, you were just buying a house and your friend or your cousin was able to get compensated by the listing broker. But now you probably want to get what you're paying for. You want the best negotiator. You want the person that can get you the property at a price that you feel is competitive and at the best possible terms. So as a home buyer, you need to make sure you're not settling on your agent, that you're working with a professional, someone that can convey to you what they provide with regards to services, how they're going to benefit you, and how working with them and paying their compensation will ultimately still net you the best deal. But here's the thing to understand. Just because of these changes and the settlement doesn't mean that the seller can no longer pay your compensation, which is really, really important. It's just the way that it's displayed to the buyer's agent is changing, which in layman terms means the buyer's agent's compensation can no longer be listed in the multiple listing service. So typically how it worked, as somebody that was representing buyers, if you were going to look at property and you were writing an offer, we would see in the MLS how much compensation I was getting paid if your offer was accepted. But guess what? That's now gone, which means a couple of different things. As a buyer's agent now, if you're interested in a property, one thing I have to do prior to ever showing you property is, for one, we have to have that buyer broker agreement in place. But the second thing is I need to call the listing agent to see if the seller is willing to offer compensation for you as the buyer. Now, there's a couple of different ways that the compensation can be paid. The first way is by the seller. Just like it always has been in the past, the seller can still pay your compensation if it's essentially negotiated up front by the listing broker. The second way your buyer's agent can get paid is if you come up with the money out of your pocket to pay that buyer's agent. So say, as a buyer's agent, I'm representing you, I call the seller and I say, hey, I have a prospective buyer interested in your property. They want to make an offer. They're interested in viewing your home. Is the seller offering any compensation on this property? And they might say, no, my seller is adamant they're not paying any compensation to the buyer's agent at all. It's going to be on your buyer to pay their own compensation. So in that case, as a buyer, you can still choose to see that property even though it's not offering compensation. And if you like the property and you're moving forward, you essentially agree to pay your broker whatever fee was negotiated up front in that buyer broker agreement. Or in some cases, it might actually be negotiated. Even though you've signed that, there might be an additional negotiation. But the third way that could get paid is that the seller may pay a part of that compensation. So let's say, for example, your agreement with your agent, that agent's to get 2% compensation in order for getting your agreement accepted. But let's say, for example, I talk to the listing agent on the other side and they tell me that the seller is willing to pay 1%. They're not willing to pay more than 1% compensation, would mean, since you've agreed to 2% with your broker, that you're liable for the other 1%. And on top of that, there is a fourth way where we call the agent and they say, hey, listen, we're only offering 1%, or maybe we're offering no percent, but we say, hey, listen, we know the listing price is $1 million. What if we raise the price to $1,020,000 and in turn, you give us 2% back that can be used towards the compensation in order to pay my broker? So in summary, you really have three different ways that your agent could get paid. One is by the seller, two is by you as the buyer, and the third one is by both the buyer and the seller. Now here's the thing, there's going to be a lot of changes coming up around this whole idea of compensation. And there will be some people that say, hey, I don't need representation. I'm just going to go to the listing agent directly. And that's really what I want to talk about here for just a moment. Now, if I'm a listing agent and you come to me as a buyer and say, I want to buy this house, my recommendation as a listing agent is that you hire representation for your side so that you get a fair negotiation, if you will. Because my duty as a listing agent is to get the most amount of money and the best terms for my seller. And even though dual agency is allowed here in California where I am located, there is now a disclosure that a buyer has to sign when they come directly to the listing agent that more or less says that my interest as the listing agent lies with the seller. It does not lie with you as the buyer. In fact, as a listing agent, I don't really have your best interest in mind. And that's exactly why buyers do need their own representation. But there's going to be some buyers that say, you know what? I can just do this on my own. I'm going to go to you directly as the listing agent. Well, if that's the case, as the listing agent, if the seller's not willing to pay compensation for your services, say they're only paying the listing agent, then most listing agents are going to go to you as the buyer and say, hey, this is my fee in order to represent you. And in some cases, it might be a flat fee. Other cases, it might be a percentage. But either way, that listing agent is still going to want to get compensated for their services because they're doing paperwork. They're essentially facilitating that side of the transaction. Therefore, they're going to want to be compensated. Otherwise, they're going to say, hey, go out and find your own representation, which in turn could lead you to say, you know what, I'm just going to do this on my own, which in turn creates a whole set of things that we have never really experienced before because you've always had to have some sort of representation when submitting an offer on a property. It's either by the listing agent or by some sort of buyer broker. But going forward, you may now be able to represent yourself, which means you're going to need to have access to contracts. You're going to need to understand those contracts. You're going to need to know how to write the terms in the contracts. You're going to need to be able to respond to those contracts, negotiate those contracts, schedule things on your side when it comes to inspections and just everything that's part of the transaction, which from a listing agent perspective is an absolute nightmare. It's already difficult enough working with an actual agent on the other side that doesn't know what they're doing. And now we're possibly working with buyers in that same scenario that have no idea what they're doing. And in turn, taking on all the liability from that side, which in my eyes creates a more litigious situation down the road. I mean, the whole idea behind this thing is to make it less expensive for the buyers and to stop this whole idea of collusion and potential lawsuits from commissions, where I think this could create additional lawsuits down the road. And in summary, this really creates more of a competitive disadvantage for buyers out there that don't have the proper representation going forward. So in summary, if you're a buyer out there and you're choosing to work with a buyer agent, if you will, a broker, understand you're going to be having this conversation around compensation coming up. Now, as of right now, we don't know when this is going to go into effect. It still has to be signed off by the courts, the actual settlement, and then we'll get these changes going into effect, which at the moment they're saying is going to happen sometime midsummer, June or July. But understand with that, you're going to be talking about compensation up front where you've never really had that conversation before. In addition to that, you want to make sure you're working with a professional, someone that understands the business, understands how to negotiate, understands these changes in the contracts, because these changes are going to come with additional negotiations and you need a professional on your side to guide you through that process. Now, this is very self-serving, but if you need a professional agent and you're local to me, reach out. I would love the opportunity to represent you as a buyer. If you're anywhere in the nation, I've created a referral link below of agents that I personally know that do business just like I do. So if you need that personal representation, do me a favor and click that link.